On the morning of January 17, 1781, Banastre Tarleton arrived at a cattle pasture in South Carolina called the Cowpens with over 1,000 soldiers, 2 cannon, and the most fearsome reputation in the entire British Southern campaign. He had earned that reputation the hard way. In the 14 months since his British Legion had arrived in the Carolinas, Tarleton had not lost a single engagement. He had destroyed an American cavalry force at Monck's Corner. He had run down a retreating column of Virginia Continentals at a settlement called the Waxhaws and been accused of killing them even after they tried to surrender, earning him a nickname across the entire southern backcountry that would follow him for the rest of his life. Bloody Ban. At Camden, he had unleashed his cavalry on a broken American army and turned a defeat into a rout. He was 26 years old, Oxford-educated, the son of the Lord Mayor of Liverpool, and he had never been beaten. Across the Cowpens pasture from him stood the man he had spent the last several weeks hunting down, Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, a man who could barely read or write, who had arrived in Virginia as a teenager with nothing to his name and taken work clearing land, who had spent the years before the Revolution as a farmer and a wagoner in the Shenandoah Valley, who held a rank that Congress had only granted him 3 months earlier, who was in such agonizing pain from his sciatica that getting on a horse was a physical ordeal. And Morgan had placed his army, 800 to 1,000 men, most of them militia who had been known to run from a bayonet charge, with a flooding river at their backs and no retreat possible. He had chosen to fight in an open cow pasture where there was almost no cover. He had arranged his men in a formation that looked, from the outside, like a recipe for destruction. Tarleton took one look at the ground and said it was the finest position for his troops that America could produce. By 8 o'clock that morning, nearly 80% of Tarleton's force was dead, wounded, or captured, and the man who had done it was already marching away to fight another day, 9 days later, writing to a friend in language as plain as the man himself. I have given him a devil of a whipping. To understand what Morgan built at Cowpens, you first have to understand how completely the British had taken apart the American cause in the South. The Southern strategy was born from frustration. By 1779, the war in the North had ground to a strategic stalemate. Washington and the British had been trading territory and retreating from each other for 3 years without either side landing a decisive blow. The British command decided the answer was to shift the war to the southern colonies, where they believed a large loyalist population would welcome redcoat soldiers as liberators and provide the manpower to hold the ground they took. It was a reasonable assumption. It was also almost entirely wrong, but before the reality caught up with the plan, it worked. Charleston, South Carolina fell in May 1780, the largest American surrender of the entire war, roughly 5,000 soldiers and sailors taken prisoner in a single capitulation. Then came Camden in August, where the American army under General Horatio Gates met Cornwallis's force in open battle and was destroyed. Gates himself fled the field on horseback and did not stop for 60 miles. His army simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. By the fall of 1780, Britain controlled virtually all of South Carolina and Georgia. The American cause in the South was not merely losing, it was collapsing. And into this situation, the British unleashed Tarleton, who spent his autumn burning the properties of anyone suspected of harboring patriot militia, hunting the guerrilla commander Francis Marion through the swamps without catching him, and building a reputation for ruthlessness that was becoming, quietly, the single greatest recruiting tool the American side possessed. Every farm Tarleton's men stripped, every prisoner his men cut down after the white flag went up, every family that watched British soldiers walk out of their barn. The backcountry of the Carolinas was not filling with loyalists grateful for British protection. It was filling with men who had not previously cared much about the Revolution and who now had a very personal reason to care. The turning point came at Kings Mountain in October 1780, when American frontier militia, the Overmountain men, many of them fighting with the memory of Tarleton's quarter fresh in their minds, surrounded and destroyed a British loyalist force under Major Patrick Ferguson on a ridge in South Carolina. Every one of Ferguson's men was either captured or killed. After Kings Mountain, Congress replaced Gates with Nathanael Greene, one of the best military minds in the Continental Army. Greene arrived in Charlotte in December 1780, surveyed what remained of his force, and made a decision that violated every conventional military principle. He split his already undermanned army in half. Half with him, the other half, 600 men, he sent southwest into South Carolina under Daniel Morgan, who had come out of retirement 2 months earlier because he felt he could not sit on his farm while his country was at war. Morgan's orders were to threaten British supply lines, energize the local militia, and avoid a decisive engagement with any force large enough to destroy him. He had other ideas. There is something essential about Daniel Morgan that the formal record of his rank and his battles does not quite capture, and it matters for understanding what happened at Cowpens. Morgan had spent his entire life being underestimated. He arrived in Virginia as a teenager who could barely read. He worked on farms and in sawmills and behind a wagon team. When the French and Indian War came, he signed on as a wagoner for the British Army, the lowest position available to a man without money or connections. Somewhere along the way, a British lieutenant struck him with the flat of his sword over some minor dispute. Morgan knocked the officer out with a single punch. He was court-martialed and sentenced to 500 lashes. He endured them, and he later told people that the British had miscounted and only given him 499. Whether or not that story is perfectly accurate, it tells you something important about the man. He was not the kind of person who broke, not under a British officer's sword, not under a flogging, and not, it would turn out, under the military pressure that broke almost everyone else who tried to hold the American South together in 1780. By the time of Cowpens, Morgan had fought the British at Quebec, at Saratoga, at Valley Forge. He had built and led some of the most effective rifle units the Continental Army possessed, units so effective that British General Burgoyne had reportedly called Morgan's regiment the finest in the world. He was in near constant pain from the sciatica that would eventually force him to retire after Cowpens, and he was commanding a force made up largely of militia, who, as he freely admitted to General Greene in a letter, he could not fully count on to hold in a serious fight. And yet, Morgan understood something about his militia that the British did not. He understood why they ran. It was not cowardice, it was math. An untrained militiaman standing in a line while British regulars came at him with bayonets had exactly one rational thought: there is no way this ends well for me. So they broke. They had broken at Camden. They had broken in a dozen smaller engagements across the South. And every time they broke, it was treated as proof that militia were unreliable, that they could not be trusted in a pitched battle. Morgan's insight was this: the militia weren't going to stop running, so instead of fighting that tendency, he was going to use it as a weapon. Pay attention to what he built at Cowpens, because there is nothing else quite like it in the Revolutionary War. He chose a cattle pasture on the northern edge of South Carolina, open ground, gently rolling, with a ridge in the center and a gully behind it where cavalry could hide unseen. Behind the battlefield, the broad river ran high with winter flood water. There was no route of retreat. Morgan chose this deliberately. He had decided that if his militia knew they could not run, some of them would stay and fight. He also chose open ground because he knew exactly what Tarleton would do when he arrived: attack immediately, without stopping to rest his men or examine the position. On open ground with no cover, Tarleton's cavalry could operate freely. That was exactly what Morgan wanted him to think. The night before the battle, Morgan did not sleep. He walked from campfire to campfire across the entire camp, talking to his soldiers individually. To the Continentals, he gave tactical instructions. To the militia, he gave something different. He told them what he needed: just hold up your heads, boys, 3 fires and you are free. Fire 3 times, then fall back to the rear and reform behind the regulars. He told them that when they got home, the old folks would bless them and the girls would kiss them for their gallant conduct. He was not issuing orders. He was making a deal that converted the militia's inevitable retreat from a catastrophic rout into the first 2/3 of a tactical trap. Across the pasture, Tarleton's men had been marching since 2 o'clock in the morning. In the 48 hours before the battle, they had run out of food and slept fewer than 4 hours. They reached the Cowpens pasture just before dawn, hungry, exhausted, and 2 weeks into a hard pursuit through difficult terrain. Tarleton looked at the ground. He looked at Morgan's men forming up across the field. He later wrote in his memoir that it was the finest position for action that America could produce. He ordered an immediate attack. The battle began at dawn, and for the first several minutes, it looked exactly like every other engagement Tarleton had fought in the South. The front American line, roughly 150 riflemen posted forward of the main position, opened fire as the British advanced. Their rifles were accurate at distances that made British muskets useless in return. They picked off officers. Then, as the British pressed forward, the riflemen turned and ran back toward the second line. The British saw the Americans running. They had seen this before. They pressed forward. The second line, 300 militia under Colonel Andrew Pickens, waited until the British were within easy range, then opened fire. They too aimed at officers, as Morgan had instructed. The effect on the British formations was immediate. Officers went down, one after another, and with officers went the direction and control of the units around them. The militia fired 2, perhaps 3 volleys. Then they turned and ran left, around the American flank, heading for the rear. The British saw the Americans running again. This was Camden all over. They had the rebels on the run. Tarleton ordered his 17th Light Dragoons on the right flank to ride down the retreating militia and finish it. The dragoons swept forward and ran directly into William Washington's cavalry and the Virginia riflemen posted on the flank, who drove them back in disorder. That flank attempt was over. In the center, the British infantry were advancing up the slope toward the 3rd American line, the Continental regulars from Delaware and Maryland under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard. These were not militia. These were professional soldiers, veterans, men who had stood their ground before. The British hit them, and for the first time the advance stalled. The lines exchanged volleys on the slope of the hill. Tarleton, seeing his center checked, ordered his 71st Highlanders, his best infantry, Fraser's regiment, to advance against the American right flank and break it. Howard saw the Highlanders coming and ordered the companies on his right to wheel around and face them. In the noise and smoke of the battle, the order came out wrong. The companies on the right began to retire to march backward away from the British line. The companies next to them, seeing their comrades moving back, did the same. Then the next and the next. In minutes, the entire Continental line was in what looked, from the British side, like a full retreat. The British infantry broke discipline and charged. They had won. The regulars were finally running, just like the militia had. Officers shouted at their men to follow, to press the advantage, to not let the Americans get away. Tarleton committed his reserves. The entire British force surged up the hill. Morgan was watching from the rear. He saw Howard's line moving back and rode hard to intercept him. Howard explained that the line was retiring in good order and was still under control. Morgan told him to choose a spot, stop the men, and turn them around. Howard gave the order. The Continentals stopped. They faced about. They leveled their muskets. The British infantry were charging up the slope toward them at a dead run, disordered, gasping, their formation broken by the rush down the hill. At less than 30 yards, Howard's line fired every musket it had. The British charge dissolved. In the same moment, William Washington's cavalry came around the right flank, and Pickens's reformed militia, the men who had run at the start of the battle, came around the left. 3 sides closed simultaneously on what had been a pursuing British force and had become, in the space of seconds, a surrounded one. The British soldiers threw down their weapons. The ones who could still move ran. Tarleton, who had committed nearly everything, tried to rally his cavalry for a rearguard action. There was not enough left to rally. He fled south with a handful of horsemen, and Lieutenant Colonel William Washington personally chased him across the field. The 2 men exchanged saber blows in the open, and Tarleton shot Washington's horse out from under him and kept riding. He did not stop until he reached Cornwallis's camp, 35 miles away. Behind him, he had left 110 dead, roughly 200 wounded, and somewhere between 500 and 700 prisoners, nearly 80% of the force he had brought to that cattle pasture. It had taken less than an hour. Morgan buried the dead, collected the prisoners and Tarleton's 2 cannon, and began marching north immediately before Cornwallis could respond. 9 days later, he wrote to his friend William Snickers and described the battle in the terms that have served as its epitaph ever since. "I have given him a devil of a whipping." John Marshall was a young Continental Army officer who went on to become the most important Chief Justice in the history of the United States Supreme Court. He was not given to exaggeration. Years after the war, he wrote of Cowpens, "Seldom has a battle in which greater numbers were not engaged been so important in its consequences as that of Cowpens." That is worth sitting with, because the numbers at Cowpens were not large by the standards of European warfare. Roughly 1,000 men on each side, an hour of fighting, casualties that would not have filled a footnote in a Napoleonic battle report. And yet Marshall, who had been there for the whole war, said it was among the most consequential battles ever fought. He was right. Cornwallis received the news of Cowpens and immediately abandoned his South Carolina position to pursue Morgan personally, determined to recover the prisoners and destroy Morgan's corps before it could rejoin Greene. In doing so, he left behind his wagons, his supplies, much of his siege equipment, stripping his own army down to what his men could carry to move fast enough to catch a man who had just beaten the fastest cavalry commander in the British Army. He never caught him. Morgan linked up with Greene, and the combined American force conducted a fighting retreat through the Carolinas that kept just ahead of Cornwallis until the British Army had run itself to exhaustion. At Guilford Courthouse in March 1781, Cornwallis won the field. It cost him a quarter of his army. He could not replace those men. He could not resupply. He could not continue the Southern campaign. He moved to Virginia instead, and the chain of cause and effect that runs from the cattle pasture at Cowpens to the siege at Yorktown is direct and documented. Morgan himself understood it. His sciatica forced him off his horse and out of the war within weeks of Cowpens, and he spent the rest of the conflict watching from his Virginia farm. But before he left, he told his commanders plainly, the victory at Cowpens had left Cornwallis without the light infantry he would need for what came next. 9 months later, that assessment proved correct. At Yorktown, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army. But here is what Cowpens actually proved, beyond the tactical analysis and the strategic consequences, and it is the thing that made military scholars call it the American canna, a reference to the battle where Hannibal destroyed a Roman army using exactly the same double envelopment that Morgan executed in a cattle pasture with militia who had been known to run. What it proved was that understanding your enemy's assumptions is more powerful than matching his strength. Tarleton assumed the militia would run because the militia always ran. Morgan agreed with him. That was the point. The running was the plan. Tarleton assumed that a line of men moving backward was a line of men breaking, because in every battle he had fought, that is what it meant. Morgan gave him a line of men moving backward who were completely in control and waiting for the signal to turn around and fire. Tarleton assumed that open ground without cover was a disadvantage to the Americans because it left no place to hide. Morgan chose open ground for exactly that reason, because it left Tarleton no reason to slow down and think. Every assumption Tarleton brought to that pasture was accurate. Every single one had been planted there deliberately by a man who could barely read, who had no formal military education, who had spent his 20s driving a wagon team over the mountains. The British had given Daniel Morgan 500 lashes and expected it to end there. He had been counting the interest ever since. If that story got you, subscribe and leave a comment. The question I want you to answer: was Cowpens the greatest single tactical performance of the entire Revolutionary War, or do you know one that was better? Because I have an opinion and I want to hear yours. More of this on the way.